We're diving into the world of Middle-earth and heading to the mountainous regions of Gondor. These skilled warriors are known for their deadly accuracy with a bow and their unwavering loyalty, as they defended Gondor's defences during the War of the Ring. Let's paint a Blackroot Vale Ranger. We'll start off with a matte black undercoat, as we're going to have a lot of dark colours on this miniature once it's finished. And I'll be using an old army painter dark sky paint here, as I already started the army before the paint range got a refresh. However, if you are coming into this and using the new paint range, then something like Triumphant Navy will be the closest match. That being said, I'm going to use a mix of older army painter paints, as well as the newer Fanatic range here. But I'll also have the Citadel equivalent on the graphics as they pop up, so that you can follow along if you're using that range. For the trousers and the undergarment for the arms, a lighter brown was added in. This is going to be one of the lighter colours on the model once we've finished. So it should be a nice contrast against all the other darker areas surrounding it. For those that have a disliking disposition to painting skin tones, especially faces, then this is a great force for you, as a lot of the sculpts are covered nearly head to toe. The only flip side is, you gotta not mind painting a lot of cloth. Which brings me to the cloak. I have done airbrushing in the past for this, but I'm gonna do it by brush today. Both methods work nicely enough, but if you go down the airbrush route, then you can pretty much paint all of that cloak at the beginning, as it covers a lot of the miniature, which will save you time in the long run. 𝐒𝐖𝐬𝐧 by Games Workshop is my ultimate favourite dark brown miniature paint. I was really hoping that the new Army Painter Fanatic range would have something similar, but alas, they didn't. I'm not angry, I'm not bitter, I'm just a smidge disappointed. However, if you use something like Brigadine Brown and then follow that up with a dark tone wash, it will be similar to just using 𝐒𝐼𝐬𝐧 here for the tunic, boots and the quiver. The last few base coats for the miniature were done fairly quickly, as I repainted the black onto the wrist guards because I'm a messy base coat painter and I got some of that paratrooper tan onto them. But then afterwards created some detail by adding an off-white colour to go around the wrist guards. Basically, we are just painting on a light coloured frame, and I'm using a fine-tipped detail brush for this. And speaking of using paint graphics earlier, I'm thinking possibly I'll do something similar each time I use a different brush, just so that it might be easier to follow along at home. Would you guys want an on-screen graphic for what brushes I'm using? Again, just let me know, as I'm always trying to tweak and improve the channel. Another old paint that I'm using is Dirt Splatter for the belt, pouches and the bow. I'm using this colour as it was my go-to for pretty much all of my projects before the paint refresh. It's a lovely reddish warm brown colour, and unfortunately this was another that didn't come across over to the new range. And my crucial tip here is don't get rid of all of your old paints when something new and shiny comes along, because you just never know when you will come back to a project and need them. Speaking from experience. For the last of the base coats, a silver was added to the sword and the bow tips, just to break up that same colour of brown, and it also adds a easy quick detail. One of the nice things I like about these miniatures is especially the details of the sculpt are not too overwhelming and cluttered. And once you've added washes to the various areas, you have yourself a tabletop ready miniature in no time. Nice! So let's carry on with the washes and get Oliver here to that stage. After the flesh wash was applied to the skin, the cloth was next. On the left, all of the paratrooper tan areas had a soft tone wash applied, whilst everything else that had been painted brown was given a strong tone wash. The intention was to do these all in one go and save a bit of time, and then move that spare time to the highlighting stage to pick out those details later on. The cloak and the sword were also done at the same time with some dark tone to add some shading into these areas. But for the cloak, I focused more on the recessed areas, rather than smashing it all over. The main reason being is that the upper areas of the cloak are going to be lighter in colour. So to me, it made sense not to make the whole thing really dark, and then spend even more time later on layering the paint up. Whilst for the blue cloth, I didn't care. This is going to be pretty dark, so I added a dark blue tone to the whole thing. However, another good tip here is to give your wash paints a really good shake before you start using them, because some of that coloured pigment will settle to the bottom and it will leave you with a slight shiny finish. Between you and me, let's just say that was totally intentional for this video, just so I can show you why that is. But don't worry, once it's matte varnished at the very end, all will be fine. Let's start adding in those details to bring our Ranger Oliver to life. From here on in, I decided to finish each section one after the other, and I started with the smallest areas first for those quick wins. After picking out the eyes, the skin was first, which had hardly anything needed to be done to it. The only things I did were to get some moonstone skin, and this was reapplied as a layer to most of the areas, leaving the shaded parts alone. Whilst the highlighted areas were given a touch of agate skin to brighten them up a bit. And done. See? Quick win. And checked off the to-do list. I did a similar process for the light brown cloth, where the initial base coat colour of Paratrooper Tan was layered back over the top. And a lighter paint of 𝐁𝐑𝐃𝐒 was used to pick out the highlights. For the most part of how I paint miniatures, I would follow this process more often than not. A base coat, a wash, a layer to go over the top of that, and finishing off with a highlight. 60% of the time, it works. Every time. Bonus points to you if you know that movie quote. The black sections on the wrist guards had a single highlight of a mid-grey added, and I didn't want this to be too bright here to interfere with the white that we've already got going on. And for the other rangers in the warband with tabards sculpted on, I did the same thing with those sections, just to keep that consistency going throughout the army. Now then, there are a few darker browns happening on this miniature, so with the majority, I'm adding a fur brown highlight to the cloth and the boots. And afterwards I'll do a secondary highlight, but use different coloured paints just to give it a bit of variety. These are probably my favourite plastic warrior kit in the Middle-earth range, as a few colour swaps here and there, it can make the rangers look totally different. And I do have 3 different PDF guides including this scheme on the website if you need a reference beside you whilst painting. Which brings me to my question of the day. What is your favourite plastic warrior kit in the Middle-earth range? To give the boots a slightly different finish from the tunic, some figgy pink was very finely highlighted at the toe end of the boot, and also along the strap going across his chest. I decided on an unusual colour for the layer paint on the belt and the pouches for his sweets and biscuits, and went for a dry rust from the old effects paints. 2 reasons why for this. Army Painter doesn't have a nice orangey brown paint. Something like a nice brownish terracotta paint would be lovely. And secondly, it saves me from buying another brand's paint or mixing up a new colour. So I'm just using what I have available in my stash, and it's just a nice colour. So it should stand out nicely over our darker brown tunic colour. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a sucker for details, especially if you can paint them on fairly quickly. And I did just that with a quick wood grain effect for the bow. Using a fine detail brush, I painted on a bunch of thin lines with a couple of paints to mimic that wooden feel to the bow. It might not be totally necessary if you are rushing for a tight deadline like a gaming event, or have a huge amount to do. But I love it, and I seem to be painting it more and more on miniatures these days. As the main focal point will be the blue cloth and the cloaks, we will move on to them now. I'm not going to do too much here as I wanted it to stay fairly dark. So the main thing was to bring back some of that initial base coat colour of dark sky. It was watered down slightly on the palette and then added onto the cloth. Again, leaving the recessed areas alone for those darker shades. And I did the same thing with some Griffin Blue. I do like this colour as it's a bit more of a desaturated blue, and I think it works quite nicely with the dark sky. Afterwards, I wrapped up this part of the model with a couple of highlights, because I love the highlights. And again, my thoughts are that this blue is one of the main focal points on the miniature. So I spent a bit more time on here than other things like the wrist guards, for example. And where would we be if a Middle-earth army didn't have a cloak? Well, I suppose the people of the Druidane like it a bit more fresh and breezy. But for the Ranger, we're going to give him a grey cloak. And you could possibly apply the same colours to this for your elven cloaks on your Fellowship models too. I started with a thin down uniform grey by adding a touch of medium to it on the palette. This will allow me to paint thin layers over the cloak and build up the colours gradually. Here I'm mainly looking at the upper area of the cloth and leaving the darker shading alone. I've also got another video on the channel which utilises makeup brushes for cloaks, which could be quite handy to watch if you fancy a different method to try for yourself. I'll link that at the end of this video for you. I did the exact same thing with Castle Grey, and once more, just used thin layers to build up the lighter tones for the cloak. For my sanity, I did this part 2 miniatures at a time, as this is probably the longest stage out of everything painted on this miniature. And I didn't want to go and rush it at the penultimate hurdle. I used the Castle Grey colour once more to highlight the parts of the cloth just to define the shape of the sculpt a bit more. Again, just using a detail brush for this. The last thing to do was to highlight the metal parts with some shining silver. When I'm painting sharper angled areas such as swords and other weapons, I like to use the edge of my brush for the most part, as this is just a bit quicker to pick out the highlights. And my trademark is to add some thin lines on the weapons themselves, just to over-exaggerate some scratches and scuffs because he's been valiantly defending Gondor and battling those pesky orcs. Thank you so much to all of my members over on Patreon and here on YouTube. Your support is truly amazing and helps me keep making the content you love to see. If you would like to join our fellowship, I'd be delighted to welcome you. Until the next time, keep on hobbying.